ESS Biodiversity and Conservation Part 2 will focus on the mechanism of natural selection and the formation of new species, a process known as speciation. The significant ideas are: evolution is a gradual change in the genetic character of populations over many generations, achieved largely through the mechanism of natural selection. Secondly, environmental change gives new challenges to species, which drives the evolution of diversity. And lastly, there have been major mass extinction events in the geological past. Here is the outline for the biodiversity and conservation movies. Use this slide to find the movie you need for review purposes. This movie is focused here. Here are the first IB syllabus statements to kick off this movie. Define the term evolution. State that biodiversity arises from evolutionary processes. The Biodiversity Convention of 1992 defined biodiversity as the variability amongst living organisms from all sources and the ecological complexes of which they are a part. This includes the diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. Environmental change gives new challenges to species and drives the evolution of diversity. We can wonder about the environmental change caused by the activities of people. Will the environmental change caused by people result in greater extinction than speciation, or greater speciation than extinction? I will outline the mechanism of natural selection as a possible driving force for evolution, but let's define evolution as the gradual change in the genetic character of populations over many generations, or as the cumulative change in the heritable characteristics of a population. It's important that you keep the two terms clear in your mind. Natural selection and evolution are not synonyms. Natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. Darwin's ideas about natural selection started with variation. Individuals within a species vary from one another. Individuals are all slightly genetically different. For example, in this slide, we can see that these ladybugs are different from one another, and we would assume that the patterning is controlled by specific genes, heritable genes. All sexually reproducing populations display variation, and it is the variation that is the raw material on which selection acts. In this slide, we can see the variation in a population of people. Variation arises from three sources: mutation. Mutation is the raw source of all variation, and meiosis, a cell division process involving the formation of sperm and egg, and lastly, random fertilization, random mating processes. These three sources of variation are present in all sexually reproducing populations. In this slide, we see a single population of snails, one species. You can see the inherited genetic variation in this population. While genetic variation is the first component of natural selection, high levels of reproduction is the second. Populations reproduce easily, by the millions. This mushroom is releasing young mushrooms to the environment, and those offspring must compete for limited resources that are insufficient for every individual to survive. Again, the second component in the mechanism of natural selection is that populations produce many offspring. They over-reproduce offspring by the millions. So populations vary genetically. That's the first component of selection. Populations produce many offspring. That's the second component. And that sets up the struggle, which is the third component. Among many individuals, there will be competition, a struggle for existence, competition for limited resources. In this slide, we see two wild dogs of Africa competing over a piece of food. One of the two will have some small advantage in gaining the limited resource. So the third component of natural selection is that there is a struggle for existence among varied individuals. Some individuals will be better suited to the environment, will be more fit. We can see competition for resources in this slide. There is a population of lions competing for prey, the zebra. Some lions will take down a zebra and some won't. Those that do catch prey will reproduce at higher rates than those who don't. In turn, there's a population of zebra competing with each other to feed well and to escape the predators, the lions. Those zebras that escape the lion will reproduce at higher rates than those who don't. So, in populations, there are excess numbers of individuals, more than can be supported by the resources, resulting in competition, such that only a fraction of all offspring in each generation survive to reproduce. Some individuals will be better suited to the environment, more fit. In this slide, you can see different species that appear as strange and beautiful forms. These species are well adapted to their environment because of camouflage. They blend in with the background, which allows them greater reproductive success. The praying mantis on this orchid is well suited to the environment, more fit in the struggle for existence among varied forms of one population. So this is the fourth component of natural selection, that individuals best suited to the environment survive and reproduce at rates higher than others. In this slide, we can see a population of beetles with variation, many beetles with variation. The environment is represented by the dark background and the bird as a predator. Those with slightly darker coloration survive and reproduce at higher rates than those with lighter coloration. The darker beetles are better suited to their environment. Selection is differences in the survival and reproduction of individuals based on inherited traits. So the offspring of the fitter individuals will inherit the genes that provide the advantage in the environment. Thus, over time, the population changes. The collective set of genes, known as the gene pool, changes. With the bird as a predator in an environment with a dark background, individuals with darker coloration increase. There is a genetic shift in the population toward a higher frequency of beetles with the darker carapace. Evolution can be defined as small accumulated changes in the kind and frequency of certain genes in a population over time. So here is the mechanism of natural selection leading toward evolution and the formation of new species. There's variation in the population, and remember, the population reproduces easily. Many individuals that will compete for limited resources. Some individuals are fitter than others. There is an increased survival rate in the environment. Fitter individuals reproduce more than other individuals. The offspring of fitter individuals may inherit the genes that provide advantage in the environment, and there's gradual genetic change in the population with favorable characteristics accumulating over time, and this can lead to evolution and new species arising over time. I had put this IB syllabus statement before you earlier in the movie. Explain the following statement. Environmental change gives new challenges to species. Those that are suited will survive, and those that are not suited will not survive. Environmental change drives the evolution of diversity. Here is an image that displays the process of selection under the influence of environmental change, a change caused by people. We have a population of insects that genetically vary, as can be seen by the different coloration of the chromosomes. The environment is changing, as represented by the insecticide that's being sprayed on the agricultural field. And in this environment, some individuals will survive and reproduce at rates higher than others, based on their inherited genetic traits. Some are not well suited to the new environment, while others do slightly better, and these individuals reproduce at rates higher than their neighbors. Their genes increase in frequency in the next generation. The red gene is represented in higher frequency here than here. A change in the frequency of certain genes in a population over time defines evolution. Here's another example. In the 1850s in England, the bark of trees happened to be light-colored, favoring a light form of insect because the light form was better suited to the environment, being less visible to predatory birds. But the environment changed. Pollution from industries darkened the bark on the trees. The light form was no longer better suited. The dark form was better suited, so over time the gene for dark coloration increased in the population. A change in the frequency of certain genes in a population over time defines evolution. As the environment changed, so did the selection, and so did the gene frequencies in the population. Here's more imagery of the evolution of the peppered moth. Over time, the frequency of certain genes in the population changed. The frequency of the gene resulting in dark coloration increased over time. If the selection pressure continues over a long period of time, new species could arise. In other words, after hundreds, maybe thousands of years, the original population would be considered a different species from the end population. So here's a cartoon that incorrectly interprets evolution, and I'm asking you to identify the problem with the interpretation of evolution, as represented by the cartoon. Notice that this fish has legs and this one doesn't. That's not the issue, as we could take the presence and the absence of legs to mean the natural range of genetic variation in the fish population. This fish with legs says he's going to crawl up on the beach and evolve. And that's what's wrong. Individuals cannot evolve. Only populations evolve. A population of fish would need to change their location and allow the environment to select some to survive and reproduce at rates higher than others in order for the population to evolve. So that brings us to the next IB syllabus statements. Define speciation. Explain how the formation of new species occurs. And at this point, you could very nearly respond to these statements because if you understand natural selection, you have all the tools. Now, let's just add in a few concepts to flesh out speciation, the formation of new species. New species, speciation, occurs when populations become isolated, most often as the environment changes. As the Colorado River slowly carved the canyon, a population of squirrels became separated on either side of the river, on either side of the canyon. As isolated populations, they could no longer exchange genes, and changes in the genes through mutation or selection on the north rim were not shared with squirrels on the south rim, and changes in genes through mutation or selection on the south rim were not shared with squirrels on the north rim. Due to the genetic isolation, new species formed in these two locations. The squirrels on the north rim are not the same species as those on the south rim. Here's another example. A single population of trees seen here becomes isolated into two populations due to the environmental change of a river eroding a channel between the trees. Over time, there are two species because of genetic isolation. Rivers or mountains can result in genetic isolation. As the population splits into two, each population changes genetically due to mutation and selection. But none of the change in either population is shared with the other. The two groups become different species over time. If enough time passes, the two species could come to be in the same habitat again, but due to their respective differences, they would not interbreed. Remember, the ability to interbreed is what defines species. The species on these two land masses are different because of isolation. Now, over time, the sea level has gone up and down. And when water levels are down, this has allowed populations that might have been isolated on different islands to mix. But deep water trenches have isolated certain species, like those in Australia, from those of mainland Asia, even when water levels are down. The Wallace Line is such a deep water trench. It has kept marsupial mammals here and placental mammals here. Isolation of populations can be caused by environmental changes forming barriers, such as distances across ocean water. Over time, the sea level has gone up and down. When water levels are down, populations can migrate, as people did across the Bering Strait as early as 20,000 years ago. Then as water levels rose after the last ice age, populations of people in the Americas were separated from populations in Asia. In the case of humans, 20,000 years is too short for new species to have evolved on each landmass. The isolation of populations can be caused by environmental changes forming barriers, such as distances across ocean water. This diagram displays an ecosystem at the top that slowly experiences environmental change, serving to isolate two populations, and with enough time, these genetically isolated populations evolve to become new species. An ancestral fox population is the common ancestor of different species of fox, some of which live in polar locations and species that now live in southern latitudes. Populations of foxes, isolated from each other by migrating to different latitudes, have become separate species. Speciation is the formation of new species when populations of a species become isolated and evolve differently from other populations. Islands off the coast of a mainland, as you can see here, serve to accelerate speciation. The different species of finches on the Galapagos Islands serve as an example of adaptive radiation. An ancestral population arrives to colonize a new location, genetically isolated from the mainland. The new environment is an open environment. There are many available niches. Genetic change occurs through time, but genetic changes are not shared between the population, thus we have a new species B. More migration to open niches, more time, genetic change with isolation, new species C. Repeat this process over time. So our next IB syllabus statements are: state that the surface of the Earth is divided into crustal tectonic plates that have moved throughout geologic time. Explain how plate activity has influenced evolution and biodiversity. 200 million years ago, not that long ago in geologic time, the continents were together, known as Pangaea. As a result of the single landmass, we can find certain dinosaur types on all of today's separated continents. While there was an ancestral mammal species present 200 million years ago, mammals had not yet radiated as a group because dinosaurs were the dominant land animal. Then, the continents began to drift apart due to the process of plate tectonics. This image shows the position of the continents 140 million years ago. Separation of the continents began to isolate populations. Evolution occurred in isolated locations. New species were formed. Diversity increased. 60 million years ago, you can see the position of the continents. The isolation of populations can be caused by environmental changes forming barriers such as plate movement. The isolation of populations results in the formation of new species, an increase in diversity. You can see the position of the continents today. Each continent has its own unique species of mammal. Mammals have evolved in the last 60 million years, a time when the continents were already well isolated. The movement of plates over geological time has led to both land bridges and physical barriers with evolutionary consequences. In Biodiversity Conservation Part 1, I showed you this simple graph that relates the diversity of mammals to land area. As land area increases, diversity increases. The continents are seen by their size and their diversity of mammal species. If you extrapolate out to a landmass that has the combined area of all the continents, the number of mammal species would be here. But this is what's interesting. The actual number of different mammal species on Earth is here, a figure much higher than what would be projected based on the combined area of all the continents. Why? Well, the answer lies in the isolation of the continents. Because the continents separated, became isolated, a greater number of different species occurred than would be expected if the land masses had remained one. Evidence for plate tectonics and the shifting of continents is just in the looking. We can find common dinosaur fossils here in South America and here in Africa because the dinosaurs were present when the land masses were together. But mammals did not radiate until 60 million years ago, after the continents had separated. So we find different mammal species on each continent. And if we look at India, South Africa, South America, and Australia, we can find a common ancestor of different species alive on each continent today. The geology, the rocks in these areas are the same, and these areas would share some common ancestral species of the different species present in each of these locations. As well, climatic variations have contributed to evolution on the different land masses because as the continents shifted position, their latitude changed. Thus, their climate changed. Changing climates, changing environments would drive selection and drive the evolution of new species, increasing diversity on Earth. Evidence of the presence of tropical plants can be found in locations that are no longer located near the equator. This is further evidence of continental drift due to plate tectonics. The distribution of continents has also caused climatic variations with variations in food supply, also contributing to speciation, the evolution of new species. Remember, the deep water trench, known as the Wallace Line, has kept populations isolated, facilitating the evolution of new species. The movement of plates over geological time has led to both land bridges and physical barriers, with evolutionary consequences. And that brings us to the end of IB ESS Biodiversity Conservation Part 2.